Ethereum is dead, or is it?
Ethereum is the best settlement layer for chains. I want the next Facebook of Web3 to be built on Caldera.
How much kind of back-end infrastructure do I have to make, like RPC or wallet integrations?
It's like literally one click. So right now we're powering about 30 L2s and L3s on mainnet, accounting for about a quarter of all rollups on Ethereum.
That's a crazy stat.
The amount of compute we have as an industry is going to need to scale. And I think there's like no better form factor than what we're building currently.
What is the biggest problem that you guys are facing right now?
Yeah, great question.
I've been working with the token.com team for almost a year now, and I want to share their new product with you all. If you've traded or own any token.com token, please fill out the form in the description below for a chance to win up to $500. I'll pick 5 lucky winners. Join the token community on Telegram, follow them on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and subscribe on YouTube to join in more competitions to win and earn token. Excellent. We're here today with Matt from Caldera. Matt, I always like to start off these podcasts with a spicy take. Ethereum is dead, or is it?
Yeah, man. It's funny. I entered the industry when like being bullish on Ethereum was the most consensus take ever. I think Ethereum is truly like the most anti-fragile ecosystem in the entire space. I think we'll see that like over the next few years. So like, I'll genuinely say my spicy take right now is being bullish on Ethereum, as you kind of alluded to. I don't know if that counts as a spicy take, but maybe I'll lock that one in.
Well, it's crazy how like it was totally a consensus view, and then like instantaneously it became not a consensus view, and it was kind of a weird thing. And like it seemed like everyone was stacking ETH and was totally on the same page that ETH was going to 10K, and now ETH is like a cursed coin. And I you're a big part of the ecosystem and like scaling the ecosystem particularly, which I know is something that sometimes people have mixed opinions on how the scaling of the ecosystem affects the token. So I want to get into that a little bit later, but perhaps we're best served by you explaining what is Caldera.
Totally. So Caldera, we are the largest rollup ecosystem on Ethereum. We basically accomplish this in 2 parts. We have what we're calling now the rollup engine, basically making it as easy as possible for people to launch customizable, dedicated L2s and L3s on Ethereum. Generally, people do this when they want some combination of like, we call it the 3 S's, like speed, scale, and sovereignty. But if you need your own environment for something, or you just want to have a chain for your app or for your ecosystem, most of the teams that want that, and it is an increasing number of teams, will come to us to help them launch their chain. So right now we're powering about 30 L2s and L3s on mainnet, accounting for about a quarter of all rollups on Ethereum.
That's a crazy stat. Congratulations.
Yeah, it's really, really cool to be in this position. Oftentimes not super fun. I'll mention that's another reason why people will go with a service like us rather than building it themselves. Like we handle all the infrastructure. And so like, when something, if like an RPC is down or something like that, which doesn't happen that often anymore, but used to a lot when we were starting, like, we're the ones that are waking up to fix it rather than the
right.
So that's some of the value we provide. So we have all these chains, and then we also have a new product coming out that we're calling the meta layer, which is basically an interop aggregator across all of these chains, with the goal of like the end goal is making it making it feel like using like one rollup, right, or using all the rollups across Ethereum, making that feel like one chain. But right now, the goal is to make it easier for users to transfer tokens between chains.
Okay, cool. So in previous cycles, I think, or maybe in the last cycle, we saw kind of this phenomenon where people who were kind of desiring to explore deploying a sovereign chain would go with kind of like the Cosmos stack, or maybe in some cases spin up their own L1. What are like the compromises with spinning up a rollup right now?
Yeah, and the kind of corollary to what you're saying, which is very true, is like, there have always been companies every cycle that will do kind of like what we're doing, right? Like chain as a service, basically. And it never worked until now. And part of that is because of rollups. So people choose rollups because fundamentally they're like easier to build, easier to deploy, and easier to run, right? When you're deploying a rollup, unlike with like a Cosmos chain where you need to find enough validators to make it decentralized, right? Cosmos Tendermint has a 2 of 3 honesty assumption, which means two out of every 3 nodes needs to be acting correctly and quote unquote honestly. Like that means you need to actually be like fully decentralized from day one, which introduces really, really high startup costs. As well, like the Cosmos, it's an SDK. So every team that's built a Cosmos chain, basically, if you look on LinkedIn, like they have a team of like at least a dozen like protocol engineers to actually build the chain, and it takes millions of dollars and multiple years. With a rollup, like first of all, it's a really great security model. You have a honest 1 of n assumption. So as long as one validator is honest, you can generally trust that the rollup is operating correctly. It means you could have much, much, much fewer nodes, and it's actually fairly reasonable to start off with a very small validator set. And like it's like it settles on Ethereum. You're borrowing or buying security from Ethereum. You don't need to pay to inflate your token, right, to get other nodes for security. And so with that, like that makes like the one-click model that we kind of pioneered like very, very, very attractive. And so what we're seeing now versus previous cycles is that more different types of people are wanting to launch their chain, different types of projects, right? Like we did get a lot of folks who like were still building fairly general purpose chains, but with a service like ours and with the ease of launching a rollup, it's become a much more expanded set where like you have fairly small protocols like startups looking to launch a chain much earlier in the life cycle of their company. The other thing I'll mention as well is actually like ETH alignment. Like, you take a community like the Bored Ape Yacht Club, right, which we work with them to launch ApeCoin, like ApeChain. Like, I don't necessarily think that a team like that's so Ethereum aligned, where most of their base, loves Ethereum. I don't know if they would go and launch an L1, but an L2 makes it a lot easier for them to make the case. Like, hey, like we're building a chain for a community. It makes fundamental sense, and it also makes sense from an alignment perspective.
Right. So you still think there's kind of a lot of value to having that like aligned capital and being part of this like broader ecosystem.
Totally.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
You guys obviously like have been heavily branded around this kind of one-click idea, and I think it's phenomenal and really conveys the ease of deploying a rollup nowadays. How one click is it? Like, is it one click and I have a complete chain ready to go, or like how much kind of back end infrastructure do I have to make, like RPC or wallet integration, stuff like that?
Yeah, it's like literally one click, at least for testnets. So, I guess I shouldn't say literally one click, it's multiple clicks, but every click is like high value, right? You click once to choose your stack, OP, Arbitrum, or ZK. You click once to choose your like DA layer, click once to choose what token you're going to use for gas, then one more click to deploy, and everything gets spun up. And, we really spin up like what we consider like highly viable chains, right? They come with an Explorer, they come with RPCs, as you mentioned, that auto scale with usage, the sequencer, of course, as well. And like we have a bunch of integrations with like all of the top providers for basically anything that people need. And to the extent that those providers also support one-click deployments, like suddenly, like within a day or so, you can have like a very viable chain that developers can start deploying on and using. That said, what we found, and maybe this is like something of a narrative violation on ourselves, is like one of the things we really pride ourselves on is like despite the fact that deploying a chain is really easy, we also work very, very closely with our partners when they're going to mainnet. Like the stage that this industry is in right now, we can afford to help people like really customize their chain, potentially even do a little bit of custom work or a little bit of integrations to like help get them over the line, and like make their chain like really unique. And that, of course, involves more than one click. So it's like one click to deploy the minimum viable product, and then we work very closely with the teams to really build out their chain and make it feel unique.
You also mentioned some of the integrations on the other side of the stack, which being Arbitrum Optimism, ZK Sync, I think you mentioned.
Yeah.
What was it like integrating with those partners, and how closely do you work with those guys?
Yeah, we work really closely with them. Like all of them have been very supportive. They all want to grow their ecosystems. Like we really see ourselves as the top of the funnel for anyone that wants to join the super chain or like the elastic chain or, Arbitrum Orbit ecosystems.
Right.
And so at all levels, like, business development, marketing, and engineering, we work really closely with them.
Phenomenal. What are some of the biggest ecosystems that you guys or that are building on top of Caldera?
Yeah. So there are a few ones I'll mention. Our biggest chain by TVL right now is Manta. They're really crushing it. I think they've actually got a really great focus around usability. Like their fees are lower than any other L2. They were the first team ever to use Celestia in production, and that's something that we helped with on the build side. And like, broadly, I think they TGE'd over a year ago now, and like they've really kept up the momentum. So they're like a good example of a team that's launched something fairly general purpose, in their ecosystem, general purpose chain. Then, I'll also mention Ape Chain, right? It kind of is in between an app specific and general purpose chain, more of like, we call it like a community chain, a chain built around a specific theme and a specific community that is general purpose, by nature, but there are certain types of projects that will get deployed there, and it's all projects for that broader ape ecosystem, and they've done a really good job with ecosystem development as well. Outside of like the more general purpose paradigm, a couple of teams I'll mention is Kinto. They're building like a regulated or like a semi-regulated exchange. They enforce KYC at the chain level. They're building an exchange. They have a wallet product as well. Like basically just building kind of like a really cool like new like hub for on-chain finance. And then lastly, I'll mention B3, gaming ecosystem. And they're really cool because not only did they launch one chain, they're launching multiple different chains of the ecosystem. Like, they have a main, hub chain for a lot of the smaller games in their ecosystem. And then they're like, launching other app specific chains that settle onto B3 for big games like Prime. Like those all kind of run the gamut of like the different types of projects and how they would use us.
Right. Very cool. You mentioned the idea of like an app specific chain. Talk to me about how that kind of fits into the Caldera vision.
Yeah, we've always been pretty opinionated that, that a lot more builders will move to app specific chains. It kind of makes sense from a fundamental perspective, at least on the product side. Like you really want your own dedicated block space because we saw in cycles past how congested block space can become on like any general purpose chain, of course, Ethereum, but you also, even with like when Trump launched on Solana, right? Solana got congested, Polygon's gotten congested multiple times. And like, it's actually a really shitty feeling if you're an app builder who's like modeled out all your costs. And you're like, okay, it's getting more expensive for me to run my application on chain or for my users to interact with my application because some other application got popular, right? And so a lot of, we expect a lot of applications to start moving to their own chain. Right now, we're seeing a lot of DePIN and AI, probably unsurprisingly. But a lot of the really cool thing about those types of applications as well is oftentimes they are kind of blurring the line between Web 2 and Web 3. And so like if you're using like a new kind of, like a DePIN product, let's say, doing like on-chain GPU, like rentals and allocation, a GPU marketplace. Like a lot of the users of that type of application, they're not going to be crypto native. So they're going to be using like embedded wallets with like social sign-in. They might not have MetaMask, et cetera. And so for that reason, like the apps actually get to own a lot more of the UI and the UX of how people actually interact with them. And those are actually really good candidates for app chains because you're getting like very fresh users. You can kind of dictate how they interface with the application and therefore the chain. And so you have less of kind of like a UX trade-off of like, this user who's used to using like Base or Solana, like convincing them to use a new chain versus bringing on net new users into your own ecosystem.
Very interesting. And then what does that say about kind of like the old L2 paradigm, right? Like this idea of this like, Ethereum like ecosystem sitting on top of Ethereum, like modeled by maybe something like Arbitrum where you talk about like a more kind of open ecosystem.
Yeah, I think my view on this is somewhat nuanced. I'm still very bullish on a lot of those ecosystems, but I'm not super bullish on new iterations of that. And I think we're seeing that with a lot of the recent launches, right? Like Arbitrum, Optimism, ZK Sync, to some extent, right? Polygon, like, Base, they all kind of have a lock on that positioning. I don't think over the next 5-10 years, will we see a lot more like real general purpose L2s coming up and challenging those protocols, just because they have like real moats around like liquidity and brand. There was a time when building something like that was really valuable, but now like we have enough options as a space to use. And so this is what we're seeing as well. Like, talk to me this time last year, and there are still like a lot of people who are like, we're going to launch effectively like a general purpose chain on Ethereum with like some gimmick, right? Blast tried this as well. They didn't work with us, but that's what they did. We're seeing that a lot less, candidly, and I think that's a good thing. So very bullish on all of those guys, and to the credit of a lot of the incumbents in the space, they recognize that like having like an app chain ecosystem or a really popular stack is very important, which is why ARB, OP, zk-Sync, Polygon have all pursued this like multi-chain strategy. But I would be very bearish if like someone came to me and pitched me like, hey, we're building like the seventh like ZK L2.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So that kind of creates an interesting dynamic between like chains and apps, and then now like the new iteration being app chains. So what value do apps have? You mentioned something like, how liquidity constraints are becoming improved, where liquidity is easier to move across chains. Like chain abstraction has helped with this in a massive way. What specific value adds does an app have by continuing to sit on a general purpose chain?
Yeah, I think we're really seeing like an inversion here for the best apps on, between like the relative kind of power dynamics of apps and chains. I actually think Polymarket is a good example of this. Like, for quite some time, the general thinking was like, as an app, you want to launch on the chain that will help you get the most users. So people kind of thought about it from that paradigm. They oftentimes got like grants or at the very least marketing support from a lot of these general purpose chains. And then, there was kind of like a marriage there at the start of the company, and then people just like stayed on the chain that they were married to.
Right.
I think that now apps, like some apps, right, like Polymarket, are so big that Polymarket could be on any chain and they would onboard users onto that chain. And so for that reason, Polymarket has a lot more power than Polygon has in that relationship, as an example. And so, because of that, like the kind of general like position and the ability to capture value, I think of a lot of these larger chains like are going down. And so a lot of them pragmatically again have like decided to like offer stacks, to help people build app chains. Because for these like big apps, the real big kind of power law winners of the space, like they're probably going to build their own thing eventually. And so at the very least, if you're one of these general purpose ecosystems, you want them to build on your stack, even if they're not building on your chain. But fundamentally, like they are giving up a little bit of value capture there.
That's interesting that like there's kind of a bit of a shift in like who controls the user. And previously like a user existed on Arbitrum or something and then would use the apps on Arbitrum, and now they use the apps and happen to use Arbitrum because of that. You're kind of in a unique place as like an ecosystem or community, or I don't know how you characterize yourselves internally, because you're both like an ecosystem but also targeting for like a layer of the tech stack where people kind of are independently using the tech stack. So it's kind of a middle ground between like how I think of something like Arbitrum or how I think of an app chain. How do you think of yourselves as a community or ecosystem, or are you really more of just kind of like a tech provider?
Yeah, I think this is one of the more kind of unorthodox approaches that we've had, at least relative to our competitors. Like from day one, we've really considered ourselves an ecosystem. And there certainly was a bit of risk there because, when you're an ecosystem and you're kind of hosting other ecosystems, there's like a fine line between like helping your customers and I think taking credit for their success. Mm-hmm. I think we've been able to thread that quite nicely. Legitimately, like I see ourselves as kind of running a similar playbook to like an L1, honestly, where like we still help our chains get users. We still have a very engaged community ourselves. We have a bunch of apps building on top of us. The only difference is like people can actually like scale with us, to their like wildest dreams. But how we think about ecosystem building like is fundamentally like not that different. And I think it's a lot of credit to the Web3 space that people are fairly comfortable with that sort of approach. We'll do our own marketing. We'll oftentimes center like our downstream chains as part of that marketing, and it's something people like generally appreciate a lot, even when they're also making their own ecosystem play.
Do you find that like users or fans or people that follow Caldera specifically are more willing to kind of use the chains that you guys create or that you guys spin up?
100%. And like we've created a really great community of basically early chain adopters that understand what it's like to like add a new chain to your MetaMask and try out a new protocol. And obviously the community likes that as well, because a lot of the users in Web3 really like for various reasons. Sometimes it's genuine passion for the tech. Sometimes it's like, farming behavior, etc. But like a lot of users in Web3 broadly, they just want like, a fire hose of like new things to try. And so for us as an ecosystem with a lot of cool new protocols and projects launching on top of that, on top of us, it's like, it's really synergistic. So yeah, like we have our own community, and like from what I've seen, surprisingly, like they love participating in our downstream chains, is like campaigns and applications, etc. One example of this actually is Kinto. They've obviously built a great ecosystem themselves, so they don't need our help. But they recently did a token sale on their chain, and a lot of members of the Caldera community participated in that because it was part of the Caldera ecosystem. And so it is like truly, truly symbiotic.
Right. Kind of zooming out a little bit, I can think of things that kind of remind me of the Caldera model in a couple of ways. And it's kind of like this idea of, platform, right? Like allowing, permitting someone to create their own thing on someone's platform. And like WordPress maybe comes to mind, or something like Shopify. And I don't know if that's how you think of it at all, but that's kind of how I kind of have a bit of a mental model of how you guys look. On the other hand, like, we haven't seen any Facebooks come out of, the WordPress suite, right? Like on some level, using these like platforms that make things easier, make it so, or at least feel like they aren't as custom, or they aren't as involved, or the people working on them aren't as kind of deep tech focused. Do you think that sits true for Caldera, where you guys are not necessarily going to, attract the deepest tech builders?
It really depends. I think broadly, actually, I will like unashamedly say that that's true. A lot of the deepest tech builders in Web3, they're like, we want to build a new ZK proof system, right? It's like, great, go hire your, PhDs, your research team, and do that, right? All power to them. What I am seeing though is like, we're getting a lot of the people who are really interested in building like novel, real products and ecosystems. I do think like the comparisons you made are fairly accurate. I mean, there are like a lot of different kind of types of platforms that exist in Web 2. They're more kind of like drag and drop, types of systems, right? Like a WordPress. And you're right, like the next Facebook will never be built on WordPress, right? And the original Facebook wasn't built on WordPress. Where we like to position ourselves is that, at the end of the day, it's like still a very technical product. Like you launch a chain, and it's sort of like launching a server on AWS or a website on like Vercel. Like, you don't need to get into the nitty gritty of, of like protocol, like EVM development, EVM node development. Just in the same way, like if you're building, a startup on Vercel, you don't need to get into like networking and like hosting your own boxes in a data center. But like you still basically have full control as a developer to like write code and build what you want. And so I'd say for us, we are much more similar to a lot of like kind of cloud service providers on which a lot of huge businesses have been built than like the kind of smaller opportunities in like drag and drop software development, which you're right. Like there are many great companies in that category, but not too many ones that like the very best builders will use.
Interesting. That's a super interesting and kind of nuanced take on how you fit in there. That's really cool. Speaking of the like where you guys sit in the stack, like what is the Caldera business model, especially kind of long term?
Yeah. So right now we make money in 3 ways. One is we charge a hosting fee for projects that are launching chains. This is actually really nice. And again, it's kind of an inversion of the usual Web3 business model where like typically you pay apps to develop on you. Like if you're like an Arbitrum or an Optimism,
Right.
like apps pay us to build, alongside us. And I think that's actually been very helpful in us make like, it's kind of like natural quality control because, and it forces people to be very opinionated about their architecture. So we like that. We also make some money from sequencer revenues. We take a small cut, sort of like a payment processor, right? So like 2.5 to 3% of fees on the chains that we run, and those are paid by users actually transacting on those chains. And then more recently, we've been exploring some like revenue sharing deals with key partners in our ecosystem. The really nice thing about us and the company and the product is like we are a huge driver of demand for other components of the modular stack, right? Whether that's DA or sequencing or interop, et cetera. And so we're exploring kind of ways to monetize that in a way that like drives value to our customers and our ecosystem. And we've been seeing some really positive things there. The other thing I'll mention right now is we are getting into the interop space. So I think just for us, like we always knew we wanted to help our chains onboard funds for users. That's always been the most pressing problem for a lot of new chains. And it's also a really nice place to be because then we're fundamentally in a lot of like value flows on and off the chains. And so there will be monetization opportunities there, but really our focus on that front is to like grow our chains and grow usage and activity. So, our current thinking is like just sort of like with like Uniswap, right? There will be a fee switch, but it won't be turned on at the beginning.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's interesting that you guys have situated yourselves in an area of the stack where you can both kind of like capture downstream flows and upstream flows. And I never had really conceptualized that in reference to what you're building, but it's true. And you guys cater to like really big fish on one side, and then the people that we hope, I think, as an industry will drive value and revenue in the future. So it's a cool part of the stack to build in. You talked about your kind of shared liquidity layer, a meta layer, I think it's called. Explain what the vision is there and how it interacts with your rollup ecosystem right now.
Yeah, the vision with that is truly to unify Ethereum. And it's something that a lot of people have spoken about. But I think a lot of people, if you look at their actions, they're doing great work, but it's not actually what they want to do in practice, like from the design decisions. So, the main goal is just to like make it easy to transfer assets and data across every single chain on Ethereum. That means we need to be stack agnostic because there's no way that any single stack is going to win, all of L2s. It means we need to be very flexible with who we work with. We're aggregating over top message passers, right? Like Hyperlane, and also top intense protocols like Relay, Eco, and Across. And so like really the goal is basically to provide really strong opinionated defaults, from messaging to intents up to the UI layer. We have like a cool customizable UI widget that people can use to hopefully like legitimately just like standardize interop across all chains and make it available in the same form with the same function broadly across all rollups in the ETH ecosystem. A couple of things I'll note here as well, just because people always ask us about this, like, does this broadly make us a competitor to the more like enshrined interop protocols like, Superchain interop or ZK Sync Elastic chains? Like in some sense, yes, right? Like at the end of the day, like when someone's bridging tokens, let's say from Optimism to Base, they'll have us as an option, and they'll also have, the more native interop as an option. We don't really consider ourselves like that competitive with those because like I think we're just focused on very different use cases. And as well, like for us, like, the goal is like to not create like another walled garden. So we are working with like the Ethereum Foundation as part of their open intents framework. We're building out in the open. We're trying to be as collaborative as possible with as many people and as many projects as we can. And hopefully we can actually kind of tackle this problem from a product perspective, rather than trying to build like another fat protocol that like attempts to eat everybody, but then runs into a wall when you actually face competitive dynamics.
Speaking about those competitive dynamics, I'm curious of what you think of your kind of competitive landscape as. You touched on it a little bit, but to me, you've always sat in an interesting layer of the stack, and have some opinions that make you kind of like quite differentiated. So who do you view as your competitors, and how do you plan on competing?
Yeah. So candidly, right now, like what we see as our biggest competitor is Solana. Like Ethereum, if Ethereum can't scale, a lot of the volume and a lot of the activity on Ethereum, and we're already seeing this, is going to move off of Ethereum to begin with and off of EVM chains and onto
Wow,
Solana.
that's really interesting.
Yeah. And so, like, if you're building a massive application, there really aren't that many solutions that work for you. Solana might be one of them, at least for some time. I think we've seen a lot of those applications will still face like fundamental limits. And we really want a lot of those people that are considering that to really consider launching their own chain and building their application on that chain. So that's truly like what we see as our primary competitor. Another thing about that, another reason why we're building the meta layer is like Solana has done a really good job as being a great place to launch tokens, and that's been a hard part about Ethereum right now, where like where do you launch your token? Do you launch it on L1? Do you launch it on L2? Like you want access to all these different liquidity venues. It's very hard to get natively, and so that's another problem that will be solved like by like again unifying a lot of these Ethereum chains. And if we don't solve that, like Ethereum will really start to fall behind as like a venue for launching tokens. And if you're not a good venue for launching tokens, you're not a good venue for anything in Web3. So really the goal is to help fight back against the SVM.
Right. Wow. Yeah, it's interesting how that token piece means that you guys are kind of now like an extension of this ecosystem battle between Solana and Ethereum, and you guys are almost solving for the fact that you guys are a team like focusing on solving real problems, and I'll ask you if you guys feel like you have product market fit in a second, but means that like you are solving for the same area and same problem set that like a Solana is solving for. That's super wild. Talk to me about product market fit. Do you guys feel like you have strong product market fit? Where can you develop there?
Yeah, I think on our core rollup engine product we do, we get great inbound. Most of the demand comes inbound. That's one of the heuristics for PMF. Like
Right.
people are kind of trying to take it out of your hands, and so we really feel that quite strongly. For a lot of the new developments, like not yet, because the product isn't live, and really for us, like there's some question of PMF, but I think past a certain point of adoption, thinking too deeply about PMF starts to kind of turn into like navel gazing. Like, if you feel, we've achieved it, suddenly we have PMF and you can brag about it on Twitter and stuff. But like for us, it's always like, what's the next thing we can solve? How do we provide more value to our users and our ecosystem? And so for a lot of those new developments, we don't have PMF yet, but we're going to get there.
Yeah. You mentioned in some ways that you think of yourselves as an L1. You also compared yourselves as a competitor to Solana. Ethereum has faced this issue where, as we move up in the stack, we've seen that teams can kind of be extractive to the base layer. You guys are obviously like very Ethereum aligned, and you have strong opinions on Ethereum. But as a business, you are also incentivized to capture as much value, and maybe some of that is extractive to Ethereum. How do you think about this incentive problem?
Yeah, I think you're right. Businesses need to, like I have a fiduciary duty, right, to extract max value, but it's over a very long time horizon. And the best businesses that exist, in the world, they leak a lot of value to their users, right? Like something like Stripe enables probably a lot more commerce to happen online
Right.
than would have happened previously, and like they take fundamentally like actually a fairly small cut of that. And like same thing with AWS, same thing with like a lot of great Web2 businesses. And so for us, it's not necessarily about being like max extractive in the short term, but like trying to build the biggest thing we can and taking a small piece of that. And that comes back to like why we think Ethereum is the best place to build for a product like ours. Really like Ethereum is the best settlement layer for chains. Like and there are actually some questions here around whether the Ethereum L1 is going to be able to capture some value from like the security that it provides to L2s. But like it's really incredible with rollups. You can build something that is like as secure as an L1, on the axes that matter for like very, very cheap and paying very, very low settlement costs. While if you're building an alt L1, like all of these chains, right, especially the ones that are actually doing very well, they have like paid, like they've leaked shit tons of value to like validators, right, and node runners because they have to inflate their token supply to incentivize those players. And so, Ethereum like allows you to build something that's like credibly neutral and secure, and inherits a lot of great decentralization properties for like pennies on the dollar versus like launching your own L1. And so like for us, for that reason, we really don't anticipate there being like any other alternative settlement layer that competes with Ethereum on those, on those points. And so for us, like we are like very married to Ethereum, and like genuinely, like I feel like that's a very good thing.
Yeah. What is the biggest problem that you guys are facing right now?
Yeah, great question. Um, I think for us, and this is probably not an uncommon answer, is it's like hiring, it's talent.
Oh,
We've
wow.
actually like we've actually made great strides here. Like, I think over the past month we've hired like 5 amazing engineers, right, which like grows the team by like 20%. So we are like really starting to figure it out, but like we're really only limited by the like number of mission aligned, talented people we have on the team to build this thing. And so it's always like the perennial challenge of like any company.
Right. And just you mentioned that this is probably an answer that a lot of people say, but it's really not. And I think it speaks to the fact that you guys are on a really good path right now. We're close to wrapping up, but I want to think about like your grand ambition with Caldera. This is a question I ask a lot as well, but like what, if you were to look 5, 10, 15 years down the line, what could Caldera as an organization have achieved that really benchmarks, that represents a benchmark of you guys, of your personal vision of what you want to become?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned like the next Facebook, right? Like, I want the next Facebook of Web3 to be built on Caldera. Like, I got into this business because I was really interested in like fully on-chain games and fully on-chain social. And I just felt really constrained by the infra that existed at the time. This is like in like 2021 with regards to scaling. And so, like, I will feel like we have done a really good job once I feel like we're powering a ton of very novel use cases that wouldn't have existed in crypto had we not been around. I think we're kind of starting to get there, but I think actually, the sort of it is a positive feedback loop, but it happens like very stepwise, right? Of like application builders, if you're founding a business, it should have a good chance of working. So like application builders, they look at the infrastructure that's available like today, then they build something, on that infrastructure, then the infrastructure improves, and then it opens up a bunch of new use cases, and it's like very kind of stepwise. And so it does take some time and a couple cycles for people to see the power of, what you're building and then use that to imagine like new applications. But like candidly, it's not just about like moving every single app that exists in Web3 onto its own chain. That feels pretty boring to me. It's about like enabling really new use cases.
How convicted are you in the fact that like in the Caldera vision, right? Is there out of 100 universes, are there many universes of which Web3 might not play out in the way that you anticipate and the way that you're building for? Or are you quite convicted in like the form factor of what you're building?
Yeah, I think the core idea I have a lot of conviction in. I think broadly, like I, I have the epistemic humility to acknowledge that there are many futures where Caldera is not necessary. I think in a lot of those futures, Web3 as a whole is not necessary or useful, which is, quite sad, but certainly possible. Or, in those futures, like Web3 is like very, very tightly constrained to like just financial, use cases, in which case, I think people will still need their own chains depending on how big it gets, but you could imagine the space hitting some terminal size that doesn't actually require like a real like infinite number of chains in the way
Right.
that the world needs like infinite server capacity right now. Um, but like for that, the kind of other side of the coin is like if Web3 is going to continue scaling and people are going to continue building stuff in crypto, like just like with the internet, like they're going to need their own environments. Like the amount of compute we have as an industry is going to need to scale, and I think there's like no better form factor than what we're building currently.
When I chat with you as a founder, it's been a fantastic conversation because I feel like it's almost like like these Russian, what do they call them, like the Russian nesting dolls, where it's like this part of our stack makes sense because of this, and this solution leads to this secondary effect at the app layer or whatever, right? And it's like it's almost so much more elegant than like what I initially knew you guys as, which was we're a one-click rollup, we're a way where you can deploy your rollup in one click. How much of this was by accident, or how much of this was kind of like pre-designed when you were in the earliest ideation phases of what you're building?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was by accident. I think, yeah, I mean, it would be incredible if we had like thought about all of this while we were building. Most of the ideas and theses we had were wrong, but I think we're right on some core ones. Yeah, like I think one of the greatest things about crypto is just like how much of a catalyst for emergent behavior it is, right? Like, Ethereum was launched. Okay, we've got, general computing, Turing complete compute on chain. Now let's see what people do with it. And if you go back and see like a lot of the original ideas for like stuff to build on Ethereum, a lot of them were like very high-minded and very noble, but that's not actually where the PMF, right, of Ethereum really ended up as. Some of them are coming back. Like Vitalik was really interested in prediction markets for a very long time. People thought that was going to be the killer use of blockchain for quite some time, and like only now is that really being the case, like a decade later. And so I think like a lot of the a lot of the most interesting things we found is just like, again, like allowing for a lot of emergent behavior to occur, not being that opinionated on like why people should run chains or how they should run chains, but just look for people who are actually looking to launch chains, and then developing theses around those ideas.
You're right. Plus, there's almost like a comparison to tokens there, where like Ethereum and Solana didn't really care what was launching as long as it kind of brought this activity and ecosystem. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. To someone listening to this podcast who maybe hasn't heard of you guys or has heard of you guys but doesn't really understand what you've done, where would you direct them, and what should they look forward to from you guys for the kind of 6 to 12 month time frame?
Totally. So the best place is either our website, caldera.xyz. We actually recently just onboarded a really great content lead called Rohit. So he's been putting out a lot more like medium form written content about the thesis and what we're building and why we're building it. And so we have like a great library of content now that people can read through and digest on basically everything we do. And then of course x.com/Caldera XYZ, no spaces, no dashes or anything. That's where all the updates come from. And I like to say like our Twitter feed is like it's like the biggest kind of source of like alpha in the space, because we just work with so many projects. Like you'll hear about like all these new amazing projects launching. So I think a lot of people really enjoy that. In terms of like things to look forward to, the meta layer testnet is coming very, very soon, like in a matter of weeks, and then mainnet will be coming shortly after. Once that's launched, I would really encourage people to play with it, because we've been thinking about interop, again, like taking like a real full stack approach from the UI down to like the core protocol and how these things can be, operated most securely. And so I think once people see, the stuff we've been cooking, they'll really understand why we decided to build what we built.
Phenomenal. Matt, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. I'm super excited to see you execute on your vision. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jack.